Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam. I was waiting for you, Baba.
You look so excited.
Yes, Baba, I really wanted to know what happened to the Prophet. Did the people throw him in fire? What happened to him?
All right, I will tell you the rest of the story now. Listen carefully. Bismillah. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and the great fire. When people realized that it was Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam who had destroyed the idols, they were really angry. They decided to burn him in the biggest fire anyone had seen before. First, they dug a deep hole to put the firewood. They gathered all the wood they could find and started building a fire. The people kept adding the woods for days and days, and the fire grew stronger and stronger. It is said that the fire grew so strong that no one could go near it because of the heat. It was so tall that not even the birds could fly above it. Many people heard about this huge fire in Babylon and traveled to the city to witness this phenomenon. Then one day the people tied the hands and feet of Ibrahim alayhi salam and placed him on a catapult so that he could be thrown into the fire. It was then an angel from heaven appeared before the Prophet and asked him if he wanted any wish to be granted. The Prophet could have easily asked the angel to save him from the fire, but he did not. I only wish for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be pleased with me, he said. What followed was a miracle. When the Prophet landed in the fire suddenly got cold. It only burned the ropes that tied the Prophet. And no harm came to the Prophet. The Prophet sat there amidst the fire, as if he was sitting in a garden. He sat there and sang praises of Allah. The people couldn't see what was happening, so they waited for the fire to finish burning. And finally, when the fire went out, the Prophet walked out of the fire with not a single burn in his body. The people were shocked to see this. This was a miracle. The God of Ibrahim must be the true God, some of them said. But most of them were still angry with the Prophet for destroying the idols. They decided to take the Prophet for a trial to the king's palace. The soldiers came and arrested the Prophet and took him to the palace of King Nimrod. He was taken to the palace with his hands chained. Nimrod had heard that the Prophet had shattered the idols he worshipped. "Tell me why you smashed the idols we worship," he asked the Prophet. "They were false idols. They were not God," replied the Prophet. "Then who is the true God?" Nimrod asked. The Prophet politely replied, "There is only one true God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He gives life and death." The king got angry when he heard the Prophet. He stood up angrily and said, "I can give life and death too. Wait and I'll show you." He asked his soldiers to bring 2 of his slaves to the courtroom. He asked the slaves to kill the first one. The guard, on hearing the order, struck the sword and killed one of the slaves. "You see, I can give death," said Nimrod proudly. "Now kill the other one too," said Nimrod to the guard. But before the guard could strike the slave with his sword, he asked him to stop. He then shouted to the guard, "Don't kill him! Let him live!" He then turned to the Prophet and said, "I can give life too. You just saw that." The Prophet replied, "Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes the sun rise from the east. Can you make the sun rise from the west? Can you do that?" Nimrod was speechless. He was really angry with the Prophet for confronting him. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam called the people to worship Allah for a long time. There were nobody willing to listen in Babylon except for one man and a woman. The woman's name was Sarah, and later she became his wife. The man's name was Lut, who would later become a prophet as well. After years of calling people to Allah, the prophet realized that nobody else was going to listen to his words. So he decided to migrate to another country. He wanted to spread the message of Allah in another nation. The prophet then asked his father to join him, but he refused. The prophet, the woman, and Lut alayhi salam then started their long journey. They traveled through Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, calling out the people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They helped the poor they could find on the way. And they did many good deeds that made people happy. In the meantime, the Prophet Lut alayhi salam migrated to the Dead Sea and settled down there. And after a few months, the Prophet married Sarah. She was a good believer, and they wanted to have children who would spread the message of Allah after their time. The Prophet and his wife traveled again for many days through the desert. One day, they happened to enter the territory of an evil king. The evil king came to know about the beautiful wife of the Prophet, and he wanted to take her. So he sent one of his soldiers to bring the Prophet to him. The soldier brought the Prophet before the king. "Who is the lady accompanying you?" asked the evil king. The Prophet replied that she was his sister. The evil king then asked the Prophet to bring Sarah to his court. He said that he wanted to meet this beautiful woman that everyone in his kingdom was talking about. The Prophet went to his wife and said, "The king wants to meet you. Do not ever tell him that you are my wife, because I have told him that you are my sister." The Prophet told his wife. When Sarah went to the king's palace, the king was struck by her beauty, and he tried to take hold of her with his hands. But the moment his hand got near Sarah, it became stiff and he could not move it. The king was scared and he requested Sarah, "Please pray to Allah for me and I will never harm you." When Sarah prayed to Allah, his hands got cured miraculously. But the moment he realized that his hands were cured, the foolish king tried to take hold of Sarah again. And for the second time, his hands got stiff. The king couldn't move his hands at all. "Please pray to Allah for me. I shall never harm you again," said the king. Sarah prayed to Allah again and his hands got cured for the second time. This time the king realized that Sarah was no ordinary woman. So he gave Sarah a gift. He gave her one of his Egyptian maidservant, and her name was Hajar. When Sarah returned home, the Prophet asked her what happened. "Allah taught that evil king a lesson, and he gave me a maid." Hajar, replied Sarah. Years passed and the Prophet grew old. His hair grayed. But he continued to call people back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sarah too had grown old and she realized that she would no longer be able to give birth to a child. So she asked the Prophet to marry their servant Hajar. She then prayed to Allah to bless them with a child. After a few months, Hajar gave birth to a child, and they named him Ismail. By now, the Prophet had grown very old. One day, the Prophet woke up. He felt like Allah wanted him to do something. So he went to Hajar. "Get Ismail," he said. "Get ready for a long journey." Ibrahim alayhi salam and his wife with the baby in her arms kept traveling for a long time. They walked for many days till they reached the dry valley of the desert near the Al-Marwa mountain. There were no fruits, no trees, no food, and no water either. No signs of any life could be found in the valley. The Prophet then left his wife and son with a small amount of food and water. This was hardly enough for both of them to last for 2 days. The Prophet then turned around and started walking away. His wife hurried after him. "Where are you going, leaving us in this barren valley?" she cried to him. But the Prophet did not answer her and kept walking away. She called him again, but the Prophet remained silent and walked away. Finally, she understood that the Prophet was not acting on his own. She realized that Allah had commanded him to do this. "Did Allah command you to do so?" she asked him. The Prophet shook his head and continued walking. Then his great wife said, "We are not going to be lost, since Allah who commanded you is with us." The Prophet was very sad as he had left his wife and his son in a barren desert where there were no other people. He prayed to Allah to give his wife and son enough food. And he asked Allah to send people with good hearts to them.
Oh no! Why did the Prophet leave his wife and son? Why did he do that?
It was because Allah had commanded him.
What happened next?
I will tell you the remaining story tomorrow.
Okay, Baba.
Before I leave, let me ask you a few questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Now tell me, why was the Prophet thrown into the fire? Here are the options. Option A, because he had smashed the idols they worshipped. Option B, he stole their idols. And option C, he burned the idols.
That's an easy one. The Prophet was thrown in fire because he smashed the idols the people worshipped.
MashaAllah, that's the right answer.
Thank you, Baba.
How did the Prophet challenge King Nimrod?
The Prophet asked the king if he could make the sun rise from the west. Isn't that right?
That's right again. Now tell me, who accompanied the Prophet when he left Babylon?
The Prophet's cousin Lut joined him, and another believer, Sarah, too accompanied him.
That's very good. What was the name of the Prophet's first son?
It was Ishmael alayhi salam.
MashaAllah, that's right again. It's time for me to leave. Insha'Allah, I'll tell you the remaining story tomorrow.